Welcome to Understanding Your Audience's Connection to Nature. I'm Cathy Jordan, Children in Nature Network's Director of Research. C&NN's mission is to lead a global movement to increase equitable access to nature so that children and natural places can thrive. We do much of that work through partnerships, and it's been a pleasure to partner with today's guest, Dr. Martha Monroe, Associate Director for University of Florida's Forest Resources and Conservation, and her doctoral student, Gabby Salazar, on a project to understand the research on connectedness to nature and how it is assessed, and to develop a practitioner-focused guide to connectedness to nature assessment tools. As with all of our research-focused webinars, we pair this webinar with a special themed issue of our Research Digest, our monthly emailed publication featuring brief findings from hot-off-the-press research or a set of thematically aligned studies, what we call a special issue. You can sign up for the digest at the URL provided at the top of the chat. The Digest special issue on connectedness to nature was emailed at the end of October to subscribers, and it's available on the C&NN website at that same URL at the top of the chat. The Research Digest and this webinar series are two legs of the three legs of the research stool at C&NN. The other and most foundational is the Research Library, which houses over 950 summaries of research articles written in accessible lay language. The links to the Research Library is also provided at the top of the chat box. Just a couple of instructions about use of the chat box. Given the number of participants on the call today, we'll be using the chat to engage you. We've reserved time at the end for questions and answers. We'll choose as many of your questions as we can pose to Martha and Gabby during the Q&A section. A lot of the value of these webinars, though, is the information that attendees share with each other. So please feel free to comment and to offer resources in the chat. If you want to direct a comment to a webinar attendee, such as responding to someone who's asked a question in the chat, please start your response with that person's name. You can also direct a question to one of the presenters, Martha or Gabby, in the same way. Within a few weeks, we'll send you a resource page that'll provide written answers to as many questions posed in the chat as we can. That way, even if a question can't be answered during our time today, you'll receive a written response in a few weeks. And finally, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be sent to you later for you to view and to send to colleagues. Please note that all attendees are on mute throughout the webinar to ensure we don't have background noise. Again, please use the chat to ask questions or to make comments. And now I'd like to turn it over to Martha and Gabby. Welcome.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Martha, and Gabby will come on in the second half of our little presentation. And we're excited to share the work that we've been doing around figuring out how to assess or measure this interesting thing called connection to nature. You can see at the bottom of your screen that this project has had a number of partners. We're coming from the University of Florida. We've also engaged Stanford University, and then two organizations, both Children in Nature Network and the North American Association for Environmental Education. The project has been funded by the Pisces Foundation. There we go. I've figured out how to advance my slides. So our plan for this session is that we'll tell you a little bit about us and the project and what we've learned in the process of doing this. The project that we're doing is developing this guidebook. We don't have the guidebook ready right this minute. It'll come out in 2020. But we're going to give you some scenarios and show you how the guidebook would be used when you can access it. And then we'll have a lot of time for questions and discussion. So many of us are working to connect people to nature. We do that in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. And measuring that thing called connection to nature could be useful for a variety of purposes. It could help us develop better programs. It could help us get funding. And then once we do what we say we're going to do, it would help us tell our funders that, yay, we did it. Could help in marketing, could help in planning, just a variety of things. So we've sorted out these purposes into two broad categories. On the left of your screen, there's this idea that an intervention would help change connection to nature. Could be an educational program, could be a campaign, could be just putting in a park. And to measure a change, you need to measure both pre and post, and you need a tool that is fine-grained enough to be able to detect those little differences. And so we're calling that an evaluation purpose. It doesn't have to necessarily be evaluation. We're just calling it that to distinguish it from the right side of your screen, which is a process that is just, we need to know what's out there. We need to know what the population is thinking and feeling in terms of their connection to nature, maybe because we need a baseline for doing some sort of long-term intervention, or maybe we're creating a program and need to know if this part of the community is different from that part of the community, or if this racial group is different from that racial group, or just get a sense of what's happening. This right side of the screen is just a one-time snapshot purpose. We're not trying to do pre-post, and as a result, we're calling that a planning function. So we're hoping that the project that we've done addresses both of these goals, the evaluation and the planning. The project has been to look at all the different tools that are out there for measuring connection to nature, and I think there's at least 30 of them. Select the ones that are most useful for practitioners and produce a guidebook that would make those tools available and whatever else practitioners need to know to use them successfully. That guidebook will be available through workshops that both NAAEE and C&NN will be doing and posted on both of these organizational websites. There's a third access route to that, and Duke University is working with NAAEE to develop a portal for environmental education evaluation, and the tools in this guidebook, and probably most of the guidebook, will be available through that portal as well. We also wanted to identify some of the gaps and needs in this whole realm and promote new research that would help move forward with assessing connection to nature. And so we've done that. We had a workshop last year, about a year ago, with 20 people who have developed the tools, used the tools, done research in this area, or are practitioners using this kind of tool. We met for 2 days in Spokane, Washington, put all these different tools on newsprint on the walls, looked at advantages and disadvantages, and said, you know, some of these really aren't measuring connection to nature, but some of them are just spot on. We talked about the needs and gaps, and we formed some teams. So let me start by saying this is what we're calling connection to nature. This study of connectedness to nature is primarily concerned with understanding how people identify themselves with the natural environment and the relationships that they form with nature. Now, if you think about it, that's not saying what that relationship is. It's also not saying what nature is, and we know that is a whole can of worms. There's a lot we could talk about in terms of what kind of nature we're talking about. And so I think it's important to realize that it could be a negative relationship with nature as well as a positive relationship. It could be nature that happens in the city. It could be nature that happens in the wilderness. We could be talking about youth. We could be talking about adults. And what that relationship is doesn't have to be one of preservation and advocating for nature's health. It could be farmers and hunters and fishers. It could be any kind of utilization sort of connection to nature, or all of these things at once. The formation of connection to nature is thought to be a product of many things, including experience, maybe even primarily experience, but also learning and culture and the kind of home landscape that people grow up in. Having a connection to nature is likely to increase environmental concern, and there tends to be a relationship, or at least a correlation, with pro-environmental behavior. So that's probably because we're mostly measuring the positive kind of connection to nature. And of course, connection to nature and the experience and opportunities that created connection to nature also has a lot to say for physical and mental well-being. So there's a lot of reasons to be thinking about connection to nature. If you think about what we're really looking at and what these surveys are measuring, or the tools that might be out there. There's a whole lot of different things that they're creating, measuring, intending to assess. They're all a little bit different. If we take a few of these terms or constructs, by experience, it's usually the frequency or the time spent in nature. Are you growing up with it? Do you live in a rural area? Are you in a city? Is there a park right across the street? The construct of awe is more related to a spiritual connection or an inspiration, that sense of wonder and amazement. Knowledge is often a part of connection to nature. The more we know, the more we're likely to be impressed with it. And so that's just the learning and awareness side of connection to nature. Affinity is something that's called a sympathy or empathy or spontaneous liking of something. Many of these tools are looking at an intention to act or pro-environmental behavior. Some of them are even calling it love, this positive emotional concern that is for protecting nature. So the group that we worked with a year ago said, some of these things are what we'd mean by connection to nature, and some of these things aren't. So let's cross a line through the kinds of tools that are measuring experience or knowledge or intention or behavior. And let's focus instead on the affective world. Any of these constructs that really are talking about that relationship with nature. So that's exactly what we did. Most of the tools that we found in the literature are really talking about wild nature, awe, and concern. And most of them are using a paper and pencil survey with a series of scales. So that's just what's out there. And it means that if you're familiar with managed nature or urban nature, you might not score as high as you should on those tests and scales. So our group said, well, that's kind of a problem, and that's an area for research, and that's something that we think we should be working on. Here's some examples of what those tools are looking like. The first one, Connectedness to Nature by Mayer in France, has a series of items with the question, do you disagree or agree with the following statements? So people are scoring these on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scale. And this really is looking at that relationship with nature. I often feel a sense of oneness. I feel embedded with the broader natural world. My personal welfare is independent of the welfare of the natural world. Those kinds of statements are a little bit different than the next one, connection to nature, which was written for children. And that question is not agree or disagree, but how much do you like to see or do the following things? Seeing plants and flowers, taking care of animals and plants, living with plants and animals. And so that's more, how much do you enjoy the experiences of nature? So you can see that even though both of these are talking about connection to nature in the broad sense, really when you get right down to the nitty-gritty, the things that they're asking about, the questions they're asking, the statements that they want people to respond to are a little bit different. Here's two more, and you can see what I mean. Love and Care for Nature by Helen Perkins is another agree-disagree. I feel a sense of awe. I feel spiritually bound. I feel joy just being in nature. So that's this positive emotion related to nature. And the nature relatedness scale has a little bit of everything in it. I'm not separate from nature. I enjoy being outdoors. Even in the middle of the city, I notice nature around me. And when that scale is used, it actually identifies several different constructs that it's recording. So that's an idea of what we're working with. And one more thing is that our team said, well, that's a lot of scales, but there's other ways of looking at it too. So let's really work at coming up with ways to use interviews and writing and drawing and photographs to assess connection to nature. So we've done that as well. So our guidebook would have all of these things in it when it comes out. And I'm going to turn this over to Gabby so she can explain how you will use it.
So yes, I'm very excited to be here today to share this update on the guidebook. And it's a guidebook that we hope will be very useful, equally useful to practitioners and to researchers, but we've really had practitioners in mind when designing the tools in this guidebook. And so essentially the guidebook is right now about 70 to 80 pages and that long in its draft form. And that's because we found in piloting it that practitioners had a lot of questions about the basics of why they should assess connection to nature, when they should give these assessments or use these scales, why they should use a tool from the literature as opposed to making their own. And if you have questions like that, please do ask them in the live chat and we can answer those during the Q&A. But I'll just walk you through a little bit of how we hope that people will use the guidebook. So the guidebook is essentially going to have these two goals, as Martha mentioned, baseline assessment and program evaluation. And from this workshop and from all of the research we've done, we basically came up with 11 tools that the group recommends for use by practitioners. So we reviewed over 30 tools and said, no, these are the 11 tools that we feel like are useful in different situations, are relatively easy to analyze the data that's collected, because that's important. We want it to be useful not just in the classroom, but also easy to analyze and to summarize your findings after you've collected data. And I wanted to just walk you through a couple of different scenarios of how you might want to use the guidebook. And in the guidebook itself, because there are 11 tools, we've created a kind of decision tree that will be part of the guidebook, where you have different guiding questions that can help you identify a tool that is best for your audience. And the decision tree did not lend itself well to a webinar, but it will be in a large 2-page spread in the guidebook. But these are the kind of scenarios that you might come to this guidebook with and want to find a tool. So one scenario is that you might come and say, I run a big organization, like for instance, the Sierra Club, and I want to learn how my members feel about their relationship with nature. And so you would go to the decision tree, and essentially it would take you to this strategy, which is a one-time assessment. In this case, you're not doing a pre-test and post-test. You just want to understand where your audience stands, how they feel about connection to nature. And the great thing about this, it's probably the easiest strategy, because you can use any of the tools that we have in the guidebook to do a one-time assessment. And at that stage, you would probably be looking at these kind of little boxes that describe the different tools that we recommend, and you could look and see what exactly it is you're trying to measure. So you might be more interested in measuring emotional connection to nature, and that would lead you to, for instance, the Love and Care for Nature scale. You might be interested in understanding more about personal identity and how a person's environmental identity relates to their personal identity. And in that case, you would go to the environmental identity scale. And once you go through the decision tree and you come up on one of these scales, you'll actually be able to flip to that section in the guidebook for that scale. And you'll find background information on the scale, information on how it's been used in other contexts, information on how people have adapted it for their use, tips for using the scale directly from the researchers or from other practitioners who have used the scale. And you'll also find a copy of the scale itself. And I think that that's probably one of the biggest contributions of the guidebook, is that we are hoping to make it easy for you to just take those scales, make copies of them, and print them out and use them. Because although there are lots of publications that cover connection to nature in the literature, these publications are quite difficult to track down if you don't have access to the academic literature. And in some cases, it's hard to find the original scales. So we have gotten permission from all of the authors to publish the scales directly in the guidebook, and permission for you to use them in your studies and in your programs. So that's how you would go about looking for the one-time assessment. And just reiterating there that although these tools, as Martha said, do all measure connection to nature, they measure connection to nature, different aspects of connection to nature, and they use different language to talk about connection to nature. And so that's why, rather than just take you to one particular tool, the guidebook will, if you're interested in measuring connection to nature among adult audiences, you'll probably find 5 options. And then what we do is we encourage you to go and actually read through those 5 options so that you can find the option that you think might resonate best with your audience. Because the way that perhaps the Love and Care for Nature scale talks about connection to nature might be with more emotional language. And maybe the environmental identity scale might have a different way of talking about connection to nature that you think might, and you will be able to know which one might resonate better with the audience you're working with. So that's one-time assessment. If we go on to the next strategy or scenario, we found that a lot of practitioners want to measure whether or not their programs influence connection to nature. So that's probably one of the more common reasons people will be coming to this booklet and guidebook. So you might have a scenario where you say, I'm still the Sierra Club, but I want to know whether going on a 2-hour nature walk influences my members' connection to nature. So in this case, you would be wanting to do a pre-test and a post-test to see whether or not that experience has a measurable influence on your audience's connection to nature. So what we found with all of the background research is that it's really important to consider whether or not your program is designed to actually influence connection to nature and in a measurable way. And we want you to consider the intensity of your program. And we define intensity as a combination of time and engagement. So how long is your program in terms of its duration or its frequency, and how rich is the program in terms of the experience that your participants are likely to have. How engaging is it likely to be? How novel is it likely to be? And this is an important point because for this scenario, you want to measure whether or not a 2-hour nature walk influences your audience's connection to nature. And what our collaborators have told us, and some of the tool authors have told us, is that most likely you will not see a measurable influence on connection to nature from a very short one-time experience. And so the decision tree will also help walk you through that and trying to figure out whether or not you should actually be trying to measure connection to nature as part of your evaluation. So you would come up, if you went through the decision tree, you'd come up to this message. Your program may be very useful and impactful, but a single exposure is unlikely to influence connection to nature in a way that can be measured with these tools. There are obviously exceptions to this, but in general, we would encourage you, if you just have a one-time short program, to instead consider assessing other outcomes like changes in environmental knowledge or changes in environmental attitude. So this guidebook will help you know when to measure connection to nature and when you should also be looking at other strategies and measuring other outcomes. And we provide some appendices that can direct you to different types of tools to measure knowledge and attitudes. So the next scenario is if you were going to want to measure whether or not a more intense experience. So when we think about that intensity, time, duration, and engagement, one that we think would likely influence an audience's connection to nature in a measurable way. So you're the Sierra Club, and this time you want to know whether participating in a 10-day backpacking trip influences your audience's connection to nature. And you've got 2,000 participants in this backpacking trip that, say, takes place across the country in different locations. So you've got a lot of people, which means that you need an efficient way to measure connection to nature because you don't have time to perhaps interview 2,000 people and analyze those interviews, transcribe them, and code them. So in this case, the decision tree would take you to a number of scales that could be used in a pre-test and post-test. And because this 10-day program, a backpacking trip is likely could be a kind of a transformative experience for some people, or at least make them feel connected to nature in the short term, that we do think that you would be able to use it pre-test and post-test. And in this case, the decision tree will direct you to some of those scales that we recommend, like Love and Care for Nature scale, environmental identity scale, and inclusion of nature and self, that we think could be used to measure that change before the experience, between the beginning of the experience and the end of the experience. And once again, you would be directed to those tools in the guidebook, and you could read over those tools to see which one is more likely to resonate with your audience. So if we go into the next slide. So you may also have another scenario where you don't have 2,000 participants. So you're not as worried about the efficiency of being able to collect all the data and analyze it quickly. So what if you just wanted to hone in on one of those 10-day backpacking trips and to understand how participating in a 10-day backpacking trip influences connection to nature among the 10 participants on that trip? So in this case, because you're only dealing with 10 participants, you don't necessarily need to use a multiple choice scale. You don't necessarily need to be as efficient in your data collection. And so we also have some tools in the guidebook that collect qualitative data. So we recommend perhaps journaling and the interpretation of drawings as two ways that you could collect qualitative data. And we also provide some information on how you would analyze that data, because we've heard from practitioners that a lot of times they collect student writing samples, they collect journals, they collect drawings, and they don't actually know how to analyze the data that they collect and find themes and patterns within that data. And so we also provide some guidance in these tool summaries on the background of the tool, but also how to code your journals to understand and answer the questions that you're trying to answer, whether it's, do your students feel connected to nature while they're out on that backpacking trip, or do they see a change in how they feel the environment relates to their identity from the beginning of the backpacking trip to the end of the backpacking trip. And so we really want to direct people not just to these scales, which are typically published in the literature, but also to these alternative approaches, so we can use these as either embedded assessments, where they're given as a part of the broader activity. Maybe you do journaling in the middle of the backpacking trip, or used as a pre-test and post-test measure to actually see whether or not there's change in your audience's connection to nature. So we hope that the guidebook will provide lots of different approaches and tools that you can actually just pull from the guidebook and directly use in your research. We will have references at the end, since we don't have the guidebook ready to go right now, where you can actually look up those papers and pull those tools out right now if you want to get started. But I will mention that in creating the guidebook and the decision tree and going through this process with the workshop, we did note some future research needs and some gaps in the tools that currently exist. And so for any researchers, especially on this webinar, we realized that we need more research on how connection to nature plays out in different settings, urban versus rural, indoor nature, and how people view nature in different settings. So there is a real bias towards tools that talk about nature in terms of wilderness. We need more research on different audiences. So audiences beyond English-speaking visitors to a natural area, people who have different types of relationships to nature, farmers, hunters, native nations. So we need to look more at different audiences, and also to look beyond the United States, because a lot of the tools were developed within the United States, or were developed perhaps in Europe or Australia. And so we don't know a lot about how these tools translate into different cultural contexts. And although we do highlight some qualitative approaches in the guidebooks, there is certainly a lot of room for new qualitative approaches to serve a range of audiences and settings. So we need more creative ways to measure connection to nature. And we also need to look at individual differences, how connection to nature varies from one place to another, from one way of knowing to another, and from one experience to another. So although there are lots of papers published in the literature on connection to nature, and as you will see in the C&NN digest that's going to come out, there are lots of research. There's lots of research being done all the time. We still feel like these are big gaps that need to be identified and addressed. So that, and then here is a list of references, and I think I saw a lot of questions coming up. So I think we can probably go on to some questions. Is that right, Cathy?
All right. Thank you, Gabby and Martha. We do have some questions, and they're starting to come in now fast and furious, so this is great. The first one I'll ask you is about whether there are tools in this guidebook that are appropriate for children less than 6 years old.
That was actually one of the things that our our workshop team said would be very important, and the literature didn't do a very, very good job with early childhood measures. So we developed a sub-team of those workshop participants, and they added a few more researchers to their team, and they spent the last 6 months combing through the literature, finding what they could find, and even creating their own tools. Gabby, do you want to say some more about what will be in the guide?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a wonderful kind of approach by a researcher named Enid Elliott that's called the nature relatedness observation approach. And that is basically observing, it's a tool for how to observe children's connection to nature just by through an observational approach. So being at a nature kindergarten perhaps and watching for certain interactions and certain behaviors and being able to assess connection to nature in that way. There's also a scale called the biophilia interview, which is for early childhood, that is more of a scale-like approach in that it has these kind of agree-disagree statements, but it's actually given as an interview to kids using puppets. And those are the two early childhood approaches that this wonderful team recommended.
Okay. And Mary had a question about whether the guidebook would be appropriate for use in other countries. And I assume whether the tools that are highlighted in the guidebook would be appropriate for use in other countries. And I know, Gabby, you mentioned that that's a research question. We need to know more about that. But can you comment a little bit on, the generalizability of this set of tools and the appropriateness of the guidebook for those around the globe?
Absolutely. So in each of the tool summaries, there will be information on whether or not we have examples of the tool being used in other languages or other cultures and countries that have been published in the literature. We also have some information in the guidebook for people who would like to translate the tools to other languages and some advice for how to approach that in the best way. And I do think that it's a challenge to translate these tools, which measure these underlying kind of concepts and feelings, because the language matters very much in how we describe our emotions and our feelings. And so we try to provide guidance on that, but it certainly is an open question with some of the tools.
Okay. And Martha, maybe I'll ask you this question. You had mentioned something at the beginning of your slides about how we weren't sort of imposing some definitions, but Ruth is wondering whether the guidebook is going to provide, or if the tools within the guidebook do provide a definition of what they mean by nature and how they're going to use that term nature. Do you have some comment on that?
Yeah, this is something we decided to skip over. um, the definition for connection to nature is this relationship with the natural world. And so people have different kinds of relationships, and how people define the natural world would be different. The tools, a good tool wouldn't care if nature is ants in the sidewalk or mountains on the other side of the continent. It was just how someone feels about the natural world that it would be measuring and assessing. And so by the same token, it wouldn't really matter if you engage people in a park or a schoolyard, or if it's this 10-day backpack trip with the Sierra Club. We're trying to look at the relationship people have with the natural world. So the tools do have to remind people of what it is we're talking about. And so they might say, like squirrels or egrets or ponds or oceans. And we think, and the authors of the tools think, that people will be able to swap out whatever word is appropriate for reminding people of the nature that's around them. If you're in a desert, or if you're in a forest, or if you're on the seacoast, you might use different examples of nature, and that would be okay, and the tools should be resilient to those kinds of changes. But in terms of the specifics of schoolyard or wilderness, the tools should be able to accommodate both. At least in theory, they do. And I think we do need more research to find out if that's really true.
So, Martha, when you were saying swapping out words, you mean that practitioners could take a word out of a tool, substitute a word that reflects their biome or the kinds of animals or plants or whatever it might be that their participants might interact with, and that would not disrupt the validity of the measure. Is that correct?
Exactly. Thank you.
Speaking of schoolyards, there was a couple of questions or comments related to schoolyards. One had to do with whether or not we need more research on whether schoolyards can result in connectedness to nature. And I can tell you that that is a hot topic at Children in Nature Network, as well as in the research world. Maybe we'll try to, in the resource pages that we'll send you afterwards, in a couple of weeks, we'll try to provide some information to some of the research that we do know about schoolyards and direct you to the Green Schoolyards resource list on the C&NN webpage. But there was also a question whether or not schoolyards might be considered more managed nature and whether that's appropriate, I guess, in the context of measuring connectedness to nature here. Does this sort of fit your definition? And Martha, you were sort of saying whether it's schoolyards or wilderness, these tools should work. Do you want to elaborate at all on this idea of schoolyards as managed nature and what that might mean for connectedness to nature measurement?
Well, I think this is part of the question. How can people build a relationship with nature if their only interaction with nature is from a city? I mean, I think they can. And will a tool score their connection just as high as somebody else's connection? That would be the interesting question. I think we want tools that measure connection to nature in a variety of that they're able to look at a variety of types of nature. And just as an example of that, the environmental identity scale was initially more of the wilderness, mountain, ocean, awe, inspiration kind of list of items. And after our workshop a year ago, that author said, well, we should broaden this. We should make it so that anybody could have a connection to nature, even if it's an urban kind of nature. So, Gabby, do you want to talk some more about how that item changed or how the scale changed, and then all the different cultures that were able to pilot test it?
Absolutely. Yeah, so that was a really interesting project. So we basically took this existing scale and we said, how could we make this reflect, how could we make the statements in it reflect a broader conception of nature? So we started by kind of just going out and doing purposive sampling, going out to colleagues, going out to people we knew who lived in urban environments and asking how they talked about nature, the language that they used to describe nature, what words came to mind when they thought of nature. And we started using that language to revise the scale. So rather than using examples like sunsets and mountainscapes, we use examples like a leafy yard or a garden. And so that really helped us think about nature more broadly. And then we pilot tested this revised version, which will be published in the guidebook as well, along with the original version. And we piloted it with adults in Russia, adults in Peru, college students in Taiwan, students in urban Chicago, and other American adults. And we found that it performed very well. It had great internal consistency and validity. And so that tool will be a great kind of example in the guidebook of how we could rethink some of these tools. But it also, I think, will be useful to folks who are mainly measuring connection to nature in more urban audiences or with audiences who, the other, I guess, dual purpose is with audiences who maybe don't have as strong writing and reading skills, because we tried also to kind of simplify the language we were using and make it less academic.
Thanks, Gabby.
Mm-hmm.
Danielle writes, you mentioned that intention to act is not connectedness to nature. I agree, but often for evaluation needs, the ultimate impact desired is that they will act differently. Does the guidebook or research you've done have anything to say about how connectedness to nature does change behavior?
Sure. In fact, there's such a good correlation between connection to nature and pro-environmental behaviors that many researchers use that correlation to intention to act to validate their connection to nature scale. So all we mean to say is that in this particular guidebook, since we're focused on connection to nature, we wanted to limit it to just connection to nature. So we don't have any of the many scales that have to do with pro-environmental behaviors in this document. But many of the scales and tools in the document have been used with those intention to act scales. And so they're correlated, and that information is in the guidebook.
And there's sort of a related question here that I'm going to kind of riff on because you had mentioned that the guidebook doesn't include those intention to act scales or environmental behavior scales. There were some questions related to whether the guidebook addresses environmental knowledge or attitude or influence of environmental justice. So can you speak a little bit to I know we've in the guidebook provided some resources to some of those other kinds of constructs, but can you address a little bit the difference between those constructs and what we're trying to do here, and where folks might be able to seek out those other kinds of measures for those slightly different constructs?
Sure, I'll start, and you, Cathy, or Gabby are welcome to join me with a response.
Sure.
The literature is full with a lot of stuff out there. Some of it is old. We found some scales from the 1970s and thought, wow, we don't even teach this stuff now. So this is not a scale we want to let people know about. Many of the questions that we would ask to find out if people have changed environmental knowledge due to their program would be program specific. And so those kinds of items are difficult to put in a guide that anybody should be able to use, but they're very helpful for creating your own guide. It would be nice to just have an example. There's one place that has a lot of those examples right now, and that is the Cornell University, when I forget, starts with a D. Cathy or Gabby, do you remember?
You're not thinking the ornithology lab?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Tina Phillips. It's her website. We'll put it in the list of materials that come out. She's got a bunch of tools that measure different kinds of constructs, and she says how you can adapt them to your particular scenario. So that's one resource that's great. The other is this portal that's going to be put together with NAAEE for evaluating environmental education programs. You'll be able to access that portal and find loads of examples, directions, guides, resources, and all of these connection to nature tools, plus everything else that the team has been able to put together. They're particularly designing that to be culturally responsive. So whether it's EJ or urban or minority or whatever, that particular resource should be very useful.
Absolutely. And I think that another tool that just came to mind while you were talking about this that I think is great to promote is the EE21 tool, which has been developed. And if you we can also put that link, but it's basically been developed as a tool to measure the outcomes of environmental education programs and can be used by all different programs because it has been developed by looking at I think like 6 or 7 different big programs across the country, and it's functioned well to measure important outcomes like knowledge or like attitudes, I believe, across all of these different programs. So it's a great kind of tool for collective evaluation. So that's one. And we do, as Martha said, direct folks to these resources within the guidebook. I would also say that just keeping in mind that in a survey and a pre-post survey, you can of course mix questions to measure different outcomes. So you could have some knowledge questions that are related to your specific program and the content that you're teaching. And if you don't have a lot of time or space, there are tools in our guidebook, like the Inclusion of Nature and Self scale that was developed by Wesley Schultz, that's just a one item scale. And so that could easily be put into a larger survey, and you would just get a little bit about connection to nature, but it might be an interesting option if you're trying to measure multiple outcomes.
You know, it occurs to me that there's sort of an interesting, I guess, overlay of this idea of the relationship between connectedness to nature, environmental attitudes, environmental knowledge, and eventually environmental behavior, and the lens of, well, what kind of intensity of nature programming might be required to actually get to the change in connectedness to nature. And Gabby, you mentioned early in your presentation that sort of like, you know, brief or one-time sorts of things probably don't necessarily lead to a measurable change in connection to nature, but perhaps measuring environmental knowledge or environmental attitude might actually be helpful in that shorter term kind of intervention. And yet the research sort of says, well, you kind of need the connectedness to nature first before you get to changes in environmental attitude, or you're ready to accept environmental knowledge, which then would lead to environmental behavior. Do either of you have any thoughts about that? It just sort of occurred to me that that's kind of a, I don't know, it's a little bit of a mismatch, I guess, in my head.
I think it's definitely a circular system. There's lots of pieces to the puzzle that reinforce each other and make people want to continue to go outdoors, or make people happy when they see that 400th warbler, not just the first one, but they could keep seeing that warbler over and over and over again and have that same bubble of joy come right up out of them. I don't think anybody knows where it starts. And it may be just part of the family life when somebody says, get that spider out of here. Or when somebody says, oh, look at the bird feeder. That develops this sort of social norm within the family, and the kids go on. But I also know that kids in the same family can have the same experiences and end up with very different levels of connection to nature, and end up with different interests and different careers. And so they take different paths that reinforce those things. And what is the fertile soil that those seeds of experiences have fallen on? And why is it so different from one kid to the next, even if they have the same home environment? So I think there's a lot that we really don't know.
Yeah, a lot is open for research. So another question was about whether the guidebook or related research addresses ways in which connectedness to nature might overlap with empathy for humans, or suggests that connectedness to nature might impact the human-to-human connections. What do we know about that?
Oh, wouldn't that be lovely? Much of the connection to nature, not much, some of the connection to nature research has indeed come out of how people relate to each other. So the inclusion of nature in self and the environmental identity scales both have at their theoretical foundation some assumptions about how people develop relationships with other people and how people identify with communities of people. And so it's come one direction. I don't know to the extent to which it will go back in the other, go backwards, but it might.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Another really important question was raised by folks at Woodland Park Zoo. Does the guideline or the literature provide information on using these tools with individuals with disabilities?
Ooh. Gabby, do you recall anything in the literature about that?
I do not recall anything in the literature about that, or in any of the kind of uses of the tools as I've seen them and as if we've referenced in the guidebook. So that is certainly an area that would be very important for future research. Great question.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think there's both the extent to which the tools would work with validity for populations on which they weren't normed, in this case, people with disabilities, but just as a research question, do folks with different kinds of disabilities differ in the development of their connection to nature? Because you might expect that they would have different sensory experiences and that sort of thing. I think that's really fascinating. We should definitely add that to our list of sort of questions we would like the researchers in the world to address. Another question that has come up that I get asked actually quite a bit is there a cutoff, I guess, or a guideline for intensity, duration, frequency, whatever that might be, for connectedness to nature to be sort of measurable? How much is enough in order to get some movement on these scales on connectedness to nature?
That's a great, yeah. That is a great question. And I think I would love it if Martha can jump in on this as well. But I would say that I don't think that there is a universal answer. And I think it's going to vary between the type of program that you have. Specifically, as I said before, whether or not the program is likely to influence connection to nature and designed to influence connection to nature. So for instance, a program that's built to teach people about wetland ecology is probably not built. It could perhaps have an influence on someone's connection to nature, but because the real purpose of that program is to teach about wetland ecology and environmental knowledge, I think you would be unlikely to see a measurable influence unless that program also involved like camping out in the, near the wetland or going on lots of day-long boat trips in the wetland and giving people time to think and reflect about their experience in nature, not just, thinking about facts. And so I think it's really important to think about purpose. And I also think it's important to think about where your audience started. So, if your audience has already had a lot of experience in nature, it could be that they already have a really high baseline connection to nature, and so you may be unlikely to see a change from pre to post. Like with those Sierra Club members on those 10-day backpacking trips, perhaps they've already done tons of backpacking trips, and so they might measure high on those connection to nature scales in the pre-test, and you're unlikely to see a difference in the post-test. And we call that the ceiling effect. So I think it's really important to think about where your audience is at when they start.
When we were trying to come up with those terms, intensity and time and engagement, we were thinking that, if you go outdoors at lunchtime or during recess on the same schoolyard every day, kids may be more bored with the natural environment that they might see as opposed to interested in that experience. And so we were thinking that novelty could be a clue to how you might build this connection to nature. And then somebody responded and reminded me that, no, you can watch the same tree in your front yard every day to check out when the buds swell and finally open up into the leaves or flower, and that simple observation over and over and over again doesn't detract from connection to nature. It doesn't make you necessarily bored. You can be fascinated with the simple observations time and time again. And so it isn't necessarily novelty, but novelty could be a part of it. It probably is more a function of engagement and how that individual is engaged in either camping at the wetland or watching the tree or playing in the yard that has a potential for changing connection to nature.
Yeah, thanks, Martha, and Gabby too. I'm wondering about whether one of you would address the idea of why would you use one of these tools, then sort of make up your own evaluation, which happens a lot. People, develop a question that they ask before and they ask after, that's specific to their program. What's the advantage of using one of these tools?
Well, if the guidebook gives you the right tool and you believe it's a good tool for you, then it would be easier than trying to make up your own. It's been tested. They're reliable, they're valid. There's somebody else in the world that says this is actually going to measure what it says it's going to measure, connection to nature. And so if you make up your own and somebody says, well, how do you really know that that's what you measured? You're just understanding that there's a difference pre and post on this particular question, but what is that really? You may or may not have an answer to that. So that's the first thing. It should be easier. It should be justifiable. You're able to take it to your critics and say, no, this actually has been in the literature and it's for real.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to end on one last note here, and it's a comment and a question. It says, thank you. I was really excited when you shared this project at the workshop last spring, and it's fantastic to see it coming together. I love everyone's questions, pushing to make it even stronger. I'm looking forward to seeing how this guidebook can connect all of us practitioners and evaluators doing work in this area. Will C&NN or NAAEE offer a platform, social media or other, for people who use the guidebook to share their results?
Isn't that a good idea?
I thought so. That's why I read it.
I suspect that both organizations will be able to use this tool to help connect people who are using it and their members and people who want to use it. I don't know. Cathy can speak to how the network could do that with your platform. I know that NAAEE has EE Pro, and there is a subset, a group on EE Pro called Connection to Nature, I think.
Yep.
So those people can connect with each other in order to talk about these tools and how they can be used.
And I think
I
there's
also want to,
oh,
if I
sorry.
could also thank Mary Ford for finding the Devise website that Tina Phillips came up with. I see that on the chat box. Thank
We'll
you.
make sure to put that in the resource page. I think a related question, Martha, real quick, this will be our last question. Are there plans to collect uses of these tools and their results? And this is kind of this idea of collective evaluation. I'm wondering what you think about that, and is there a place in perhaps Duke's work to plug in results from people out there using these connectedness to nature tools?
I think that we're going to learn a lot more in when people start using these tools and communicating with each other. Certainly, there's an opportunity to say, in these nature centers, we use this tool. They're all using the same tool. They all have different programs. But look, we're seeing a change from pre to post. Or these are the kinds of programs where we are detecting a change, and these aren't. So is that the tool, or is that the program, or is that the population? Questions out there. The portal that Duke is developing with Pisces is also looking at collective evaluation. So I think the intent is that there will be some effort behind that portal that will begin to amalgamate some of these results from using the same tool in different circumstances. And we'll find out more what that means.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much to Martha and Gabby, and to all of you attendees for your great questions. Love it when you guys comment in the chat and answer each other's questions and post resources for each other. That's wonderful. This webinar has been recorded, and it'll be available via a follow-up email in a couple of weeks, along with a resource sheet in which we'll document our responses, Martha and Gabby's responses, to as many of your questions that were posed in the chat as we possibly can, along with other links that we've been talking about. So please feel free to share that recording and those resource pages with your colleagues who couldn't be with us today. And just to note, through your registration and participation in this free webinar, you are subscribing to C&NN Communications. You can always opt out or unsubscribe at any time. So thank you again so much for your participation. Thank you, Martha and Gabby. Everyone have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cathy.